This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a little bit more height impaired than Dunn, so I hope everybody can see me from at least the nose above over this monitor. It's good to see all these familiar faces and some new ones. I feel like I'm back in Plantations. We could have had this over at the Nevin Welcome Center. And hello, Geneva. Well, yes, I'm going to be talking a little bit about biocultural conservation, and I'm going to go through slowly getting to that point, but then talk about why it's important that botanic gardens play a role both in environmental or biological conservation as well as cultural and linguistic. I'm going to make sure I find the right button here, but first of all, just a little bit about plantations. For those of you who don't get out much, or for those who are newer than I, it might be just useful to just have a little brief overview as to who we are and what we do. But our mission, if you just want to boil it down to 3 words, is probably not much different from any other public garden in the world. We're involved in cultivation of plants, of course, and their display, conservation, which includes these days also a very heavy focus on sustainability and sustainable practices, and education, both formal and informal. Because of the way we do these things with a high level of professionalism, curatorial professionalism, we do consider ourselves, as do zoos and aquaria, as living museums. We curate our collections with the highest degree of professional accuracy. We want to know everything about every plant that comes in, where it came from, how it's doing, what its health is, its provenance, all these kinds of things. And this makes the collections that we have much more useful and easier to be integrated into various scientific and academic activities. So as such, we're integral to CALS, as well as to Cornell more broadly. And there's that more broadly part that I think may become a little bit more apparent as we go through this in terms of other kinds of academic pursuits. And again, for those who don't get out much, Plantations is a fairly complex entity with the botanic gardens around the Welcome Center, the Arboretum across the way here, as well as 34 natural areas. So the total land area is somewhere around 3,500 acres. That's the word, not hectares, acres. So we are a place that provides solace, it provides places for recreation, informal and formal education, as I was saying before, places in which faculty can bring their students, or students can bring themselves down there and learn and study and reflect. So our collections are based on any number of different themes. Some may be more geographic or ecological, and some more horticultural or taxonomic, such as the rhododendron garden, the Robeson York State Herb Garden. Pam Shade is the gardener extraordinaire for this plot. It's one of the best, but reputed to be one of the best herb gardens in the country. And it's absolutely a fantastic resource for anybody who's interested in the ways in which herbs have been used for culinary purposes, medicinal purposes, in art and literature and the like, and through history. And you know, Don was sort of alluding to the weather right now and how am I adapting, but I'm doing fine, actually. I'm going to Hawaii on Wednesday for a few days. It's business, don't worry, it's all business. But even this time of year, there's plenty to do outside in terms of horticulture, and the winter interest, as horticulturists or landscape architects say, of gardens in the winter can be quite stunning and striking. Gives you more of an opportunity to look at parts of the plant other than the leaves and the flowers. You can look at the bark and the color and buds and fruits that are still hanging on there. So the Mulestein Family Winter Garden is a fantastic resource. And of course, there's the 100-acre Arboretum, all the natural areas that are around us, the Cascadilla and Fall Creek Gorge trails, which are all part of under our purview. And then getting into some of the sustainability things. I haven't talked about the Nevin Welcome Center, but you know and Don knows more about this than I do, LEED certified, the Biocultural garden, helping manage some of the runoff that comes from the surrounding area, the parking lot, et cetera, and sort of filtering it, biofiltering it before the water gets into BB Lake. But the faculty and student research is something that I really want to put a great deal of emphasis on in the next few years, not just to our sort of kinship in the plant sciences and horticulture and environmental sciences, but also in the humanities as well, and bring more artists down there and musicians and the like. and really bulk up our education programs so that we appeal to a broad cadre of students, be they people who are looking for formal education or those who are just coming for a more informal experience. So for me and for many of us here, plants are inspirational. They inspire us in terms of our research or in terms of the way we manage our gardens at home or at work, and they've inspired some people to sort of rather perplexing ways of displaying plants in some places, such as in Versailles. But also they inspire in terms of other kinds of things. We have charismatic megafauna, such as the panda bear and elephants, this kind of thing. We do have charismatic megaflora as well, for Christ's sake. So we need to try and get people involved and excited about the world of plants through any kinds of hook. And plants and nature and natural systems have inspired the arts in any number of ways. And this is one of my favorite recent novels, Barbara Kingsolver's Prodigal Summer, which has a great exposition of how nature works, but also how people interact with nature and some of the conflicts that are there and some of the ways in which those two different types of systems mesh. And of course it shows up in any, in art through the painting through the ages. This is Childe Hassam's painting of Celia Thaxter's garden at what's now Shoals Marine Lab, or Appledore Island. And this is Celia Thaxter in her garden. So we're inspired by the art, but the art was inspired by the garden, so it all comes sort of full circle. And it can come full circle in other ways too, such as putting art in the garden, such as Chihuly's glassworks. This was a recent, well, not that recent, I guess almost 10 years ago, installation at Phipps, but Dale Chihuly's been traipsing around the world, putting in his glasswork in various places. And I think this is great to a point. If people come just for the art and forget to look at anything else around it, I'm not sure that much has been achieved, other than the cash register ringing. And then of course here we have these sculptures, which were part of a student project back in the 60s. So these are now sculptures in the Arboretum, but actually the Arboretum came later, probably about 20 years later. These were put in the early 60s. And the Arboretum wasn't officially established until 1982. So this whole thing sort of, you might say, this forest grew up around these things. And then Jack Elliott, who's over in human ecology, his sculpture, well actually it's not a sculpture, it is a maple root structure that was in front of the Johnson Museum for a while last summer, and then we had it transported down to us. So the ways in which we can engage people in art that has a botanical or environmental focus, and then get them hooked, and then get more talking about plants and what they mean to them in their daily lives and in today's society. And one of the unfortunate aspects of today's society is that many of the plants and natural resources or systems that we study are increasingly threatened by one thing or another, one thing being land use changes and deforestation, invasive species, climate change. So here for instance, this has an impact, not just, climate change has an impact not only on natural systems, but on gardening and how we garden. So here's the hardiness zone map from 1919. You can see here we are firmly ensconced in zone 5, and here is zone 3 up here, the dark area. Now here in the 2006 version, we're almost out of zone 5, and look what happened to zone 3. It's almost non-existent in the conterminous United States. So this has a great impact on gardening as well as our ability to manage our collections in botanic gardens, and we need to be thinking ahead as to how we're going to manage our collections in the light of these changes. Now, one great thing about being a living museum and keeping great records on everything that we do is we can look at phenological data that we have in our archives and in our notebooks and look to see how phenological events have changed over the course of time. And we're doing this in Chicago and also in Hawaii. The Royal Botanic Garden Kew has been doing a lot of work on this. And we have colleagues in Boston too, Richard Primack, who's been publishing quite extensively on this phenomenon as well. But if you look at the flowering dates of Narcissus at Kew, back in the 1950s, so the average flowering date was the 9th of March, and now it's late January. So it's almost 6-week shift in the flowering phenology just of that one species. They did this for about 24 different spring flowering ephemerals and perennials too, and see a very similar shift, anywhere from about 4 weeks to 8 to 10 weeks. So it's significant, and I just got an email from a friend in Germany last week saying spring is here. I said, well, already? So it's amazing. So these things, these various environmental issues have a pose a great threat to the plant life of the world. And Chris Thomas published a paper about 10 years ago looking at how many species in the world are, quote unquote, committed to extinction if the current trends continue. And for separating out plants from everything else, he indicated that depending on where you are in the Amazon, for instance, and what's already been occurring in certain places within the Amazon, anywhere from 50 to 80% of the flora there is at risk of extinction in the next 50 years or so. So in Europe, it's not quite so bad, not because it's a more resilient system, but because so much has already been wiped out. There's only very little left to be wiped out. So Norm Myers and others since him have developed what we call biodiversity hotspots, which are just regions of the world where the flora and fauna is at particular risk of extinction due to some of those factors that I've already mentioned. And as you know, and as you can see from here, these tend to be in the tropics and subtropics and in the Mediterranean region. And sometimes you say, well, out of a crisis comes opportunity, and this is an opportunity for us, I suppose, as a profession and in horticulture and the botanic garden community to take a leadership role in better understanding and communicating about some of these issues that are happening and the effects that they will have on the natural world. British ecologist William Sutherland was looking at all of this and looking at endangerment of birds and mammals using the IUCN, that's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, using their red listing criteria, and determined that of the almost 10,000 species of bird in the world, 12% of them are at risk of extinction in the next few decades. Of the 4,500 or so species of mammals, 24%. And then he said to himself, well, let's for fun just try and use these IUCN criteria for endangerment and see how they might apply to something else like endangered languages. And it doesn't work very well. But he tried to shoehorn some of these things into those criteria, and he came up with a number of 25% of the world's languages are endangered. So bits of our humanity are as threatened as other aspects of the biota of the world. However, that's actually quite a low estimate because there are better ways of estimating the percentages of languages that are endangered. And UNESCO uses a fairly rigorous set of criteria, and they've estimated that about 50% of the 7,000 existing languages are endangered. And long-term trends, we're losing about a language about every 2 weeks. So about this time last year, there was the last living speaker of a language in Scotland. It's called the Fisherfolk language. That person died, so that language is gone. There was something in the press maybe several weeks ago about the last speaker of a Native American language in the Southwest. So we're seeing this happening more and more frequently. So people who study endangered languages have tried to mimic some of these this hotspot theme and looking at language extinction hotspots. And again, as you might expect, the greatest vulnerability is in the tropics and subtropics, where natural systems are being rapidly degraded by deforestation and resource extraction and native peoples, indigenous peoples being displaced. Of course, there are other pockets up in northwestern North America and northeastern Russia and China as well, where there are small, isolated indigenous groups. So if we're looking at the relationship, so what we're seeing here is the explicit relationship, cause and effect relationship between the loss of biological diversity around the world and the loss of linguistic and cultural diversity. They go hand in hand. As one erodes away, is taking the others down with it. And so this examination of the relationship between biological conservation and cultural or linguistic conservation we call biocultural conservation. And this is an area I think gardens can become more deeply engaged in. As we lose a culture or a language, we lose the information that they have, what we call the indigenous ecological knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge about the natural world around them. I went to a lecture last year by a woman who's, I don't know what you call her, sort of maybe an ethnomusicologist, but she was looking at Aboriginal dances in various groups throughout northern Australia. And she was showing these videos of these people dancing, and then she was sort of breaking it down, parsing it down, showing how each motion had something to do with the life cycle of a species of bird. You know, when it fledged, when it bred, how many offspring it had, so this whole ritual around it. So once that language is gone, then all that knowledge, we may call it indigenous or traditional ecological knowledge, but it's damn good ecological knowledge, all of that disappears. So we're all the poorer for it as humanity. So if we're in Hawaii, or a native Hawaiian, and any one of these particular plants were to disappear, then the native Hawaiian culture, which is now going through a renaissance, would lose a significant portion of its identity. So the taro, which is an important staple crop. The koa, or acacia koa, which is used for building canoes and other utilitarian vessels. The ohia lohua, the metrosideros, which is used in lei making and other kinds of ornamental purposes. These are, some people might refer to these as sort of cultural keystone species, as opposed to ecological keystone species, but they're central to the culture. Once they're gone, they're gone. And the taro, as some of you might know, is a sacred plant throughout many of the Pacific Island cultures. They believe that that's their ancestry. And I won't get into the mythology of that at the moment, but in Vanuatu, for instance, the residents there say, we do not cultivate taro to live, but live to cultivate taro, because it's keeping alive their ancestral heritage. And if you follow the news about GMO and all that kind of thing, there's been quite a bit of hue and cry about this, particularly in the Pacific Islands. I mean, it worked okay with the papaya, and in fact, there was a Cornell breeder who came up with a ring spot resistant papaya, and that's now being widely grown in Hawaii, but that's one of the exceptions. There are also diseases of taro that have been going, through the Pacific from time to time and wiped out much of the taro cultivation in Samoa, and so they resorted reluctantly to using GMO taro. Well, the Hawaiians said no way, the Vanuatuans said no way, because you don't do GMO on your ancestor. I mean, it's just heretical. So there's been a lot of instances in which sort of quote-unquote Western science or Western approaches to things have conflicted or intersected with some of the other traditional ones, but it's an opportunity for learning more about how other cultures see the world around them and appreciate that more heavily. So with respect to sea level rise, again, in the Pacific, the Republic of Kiribati, which is about 32 flat coral atolls, no more than 2 meters high. And this is a trivia thing. So if somebody says, so what's the only country in the world which is present in all 4 hemispheres? So it'd be Kiribati, because the international date line comes right down here, and the equator goes right through here. So it's in all 4 hemispheres. Anyway, so sea level rise, just a few centimeters of sea level rise is going to cause huge issues, as it is now. Here's the capital town. It's underwater. Here are people who have never seen water above their knees on these atolls. It's now already up to their ankles or above. And so now what they're doing is trying to find a home. They're going to be one of the first entire nations that is sort of an environmental refugee status. Fiji, at the time I put this together, negotiating to buy, now they're negotiating, can we just please live there? 5,000 acres in Fiji. Fiji is saying no at the moment, and now they're seeing if either Australia or New Zealand will take some of them. These people, about 100,000 people. Now if you go a little further afield, up to the northwest, North America, this is Alaska and the Northwest Territories. There are about 24 different languages and cultures here of First Nations people, or whatever the appropriate term is these days, any one of which is dwindling. So if we look at this area up here with the Inupiat, or in the far northern part, as the sea water temperature rises, they're finding the whales and other mammals and animals that they hunt are moving further north. And so they're out there hunting in these sort of rudimentary canoes, and they can't get out as far, or they may be able to get out as far, but there's nowhere they're going to get back in time. And so their ability to hunt for the resources that they need is being increasingly diminished. And there's a nice write-up about this in a book recently, Kivalina, that's the name of the town in which they live. So these environmental changes are changing the natural world, which is having a direct consequence on the cultural world. And here is part of their landscape that's just literally melting and going away and going into the ocean. So people who study this, botanists and ethnobotanists, anthropologists, linguists, have been trying to develop a map. Or how can we display or portray this biocultural diversity? We showed languages in terms of hotspots, biological hotspots, but what about this biocultural thing, combining the two? It's very difficult because they're two very different types of data and information. So combining the two into a single index is almost It's not impossible, but it's very difficult. And so this was a very crude attempt by David Lowe and John Harmon. An entire countries are coded a single color, or even here, an entire continent, certain colors. So the deeper the color, the more endangered are both the biological elements and the cultural elements within that region. And it doesn't show, therefore, because of the lack of fine grain, some of these areas up here or up here in the northwest, or even across northern Australia, where there are huge numbers of very small indigenous groups remaining. This was another attempt that UNESCO did along with the World Wildlife Fund that's just as unsatisfying. The colors here are just depicting the bioregions of the world, and you can't see at this scale, but they're just little dots everywhere. It just shows where an endangered culture or endangered language is. So they just superimpose one thing over another. So it's still a work in progress. So I show this. This is a rare plant in Hawaii. It's extinct in the wild. This is Cyanea truncata. The only place in the world you can see this is in a test tube at the Lion Arboretum. What we can do is we can clone it. Every individual will be genetically identical, but at least we can clone it, and if there's a habitat suitable, we can put it back out into nature once we grow these things up in the greenhouse. But you can't put a culture in a test tube. You can do that with plants, but once the culture is gone, it's gone. And no lesser person than Francois Jacob, the Nobel laureate in medicine in 1965, said that in humans, natural diversity is further strengthened by cultural diversity. And I'm hoping that we can, as we develop our programs more at the Cornell Plantations and with partnership from people at Cornell, other departments, that we can dive into this issue more deeply. There are a number of international entities, treaties and conventions and such that draw these two issues together. The Convention on Biological Diversity, which every nation in the world has ratified except the US. George Herbert Walker Bush signed it, but Congress didn't ratify it. So we try to live up to its tenets, to its articles, but there's no mandate that we do so. But I think it seems to be the right thing to do, and most people who work in gardens and museums respect the Convention on Biological Diversity. But in a number of places within this convention, including this Article 8J, they do refer to maintaining indigenous and local communities for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. So they're making an attempt here, again, to bring these two together. We can't do the one without the other. Something that's a little bit more close to home for those in the botanic garden world is the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation, which came out of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And a number of us from gardens around the world worked quite a bit on developing this over the last 10 years or so. And it has targets. We had targets from 2000, 2010, and now we have new targets from 2010 to 2020, such as inventorying and having electronic databases that document every living plant in the world and all these kinds of things. Because how are we going to preserve what we have unless we know exactly what we have and know the full extent of it? So one of these targets, again, like the Convention on Biological Diversity, again refers to this intersection between biological and cultural conservation, halting the decline of plant resources and associated indigenous and local knowledge, innovations, and practices. And that's just a snippet out of that target, so you can get the gist of it. And I think there are 18 or 20 of these targets. Some of them have to do, as I said, with digitizing the flora of the world and these kinds of things where you can say, yes, we've done this much, we've done 75% of it, or 85, or whatever the case may be. Developing new educational programs or communication strategies around all of this. This is a much harder one to get a grip on. And it's the one that tends to be ignored just because it's a little bit more difficult to address. But gardens are addressing this nonetheless. Those of you who've been to New York much or been to Queens Botanic Garden know that it's probably in one of the most ethnically diverse places in the US. And they've made an explicit attempt to draw in the various ethnic groups that are within their area and give them a place where they can express themselves culturally, particularly as it relates to foods and plants and that within their daily lives. And so they have a number of events, a number of festivals that aren't catered just for, for Filipinos to Filipinos, but Filipinos to everybody else, so everybody can get a taste, figuratively and literally, of what that culture represents and how plants are centrally important to the maintenance of their culture. I've been working on and off with Her Highness Basma bin Ali in Jordan, who is establishing a network of new botanic gardens throughout Jordan. There'll be a main central garden in Amman and then other satellite gardens throughout the country. And those satellite ones are intended to do two things. One is to showcase the biota and the biological diversity of that particular region, and the other is to show the cultural significance of the peoples in that region, because they vary from place to place. So these are, even though she's not calling it that, these are biocultural gardens. She's financing these personally because the government is not doing it, even though she's part of the royal family. So she's doing it herself. And another place that's doing this, and I consulted with them briefly a couple of years ago, is in South Korea, where they're building a new city southwest of Seoul. This city is going to be huge. It's going to be about 3 times the size of Paris or some such thing. And it's enormous. And this is a scale model that they have in the visitor center, showcasing this new big R&D and city, and have all these fancy apartments and all these kinds of things. The only thing they've done so far is build the seawall, which is the world's longest seawall, 35 kilometers long, with a 4-lane highway on the top and two-lane highways on either side. It's really grotesque in some ways. So they're doing this in this estuary. And the only saving grace, and the lighting in here doesn't allow it to show up very clearly, is right in here. This is what they wanted me to come there for, is they're building a 100-hectare biocultural garden. So it's going to be a garden that showcases the biological heritage and cultural heritage of that part of the Korean peninsula and the Chinese mainland that's just across the sea from there, which I thought was quite interesting. I'm not particularly a fan of the rest of what they're proposing to do here, particularly all these big golf courses and that kind of thing. But this is just a plan, and these things change. And as you know, given the current economic state of the world, it's probably just as likely that this will never happen. But there are people who are thinking about this, at least in terms of how can we bring people and the cultural heritage of the world more close to the issues that we're facing, and with respect to conserving the natural world. So as Don alluded to, when I was at University of Hawaii, I established a Center for Biocultural Studies there, and what we did was draw in people from anthropology, linguistics, the law school, as they had law faculty who were looking at climate change and its impacts on indigenous peoples and resource extraction, indigenous intellectual property rights, and all these kinds of things. So it ran the gamut. I mean, there was very few departments at the university that didn't in some way have some connection to this particular issue. And we developed partnerships as part of that, and MOUs with the University of Auckland in New Zealand. What we were doing in Hawaii relates to what's going on there with the Maori population. UNESCO is interested in this too. At the University of South Pacific in Fiji, the Smithsonian, through their Recovering Voices program, the East-West Center, which is a nonprofit big think tank in Honolulu, looking at ways in which Western and Eastern cultures can intersect and support one another. So there's a lot of interest in this. It's just a matter of articulating what the issues are and making connections with people in other disciplines. We held which is now every other year, an international conference on endangered languages at the University of Hawaii, and we had people come there from all over the world, including people from Google. They sent 6 people to this. We had no idea they were coming. They just came in, they said, announced themselves, and after the conference they said, we want to help you build a website just for endangered languages. So they did. They built it for us, and now all we have to do is find the linguists, ethnobotanists, ethnomusicologists, and others who are documenting endangered languages and cultures and put their information on this publicly accessible site. It's like a well-managed or well-edited wiki, it really is what it is. So there are people now at the University of Hawaii who manage this, and as new information comes in, they vet it and make sure it's all up to snuff. And now, bringing all this back closer to home, you're saying, what the hell does this have to do with Ithaca and Cornell? And this is the white, well, I shouldn't have said this is a white pine tree. I should say, who knows what this tree is? Come on. And then, Robert, yeah, you know. So this is an iconic tree in the northern, sort of mixed hardwoods forests everywhere from Minnesota to the northeast. And it holds a special place in Native American culture. The Haudenosaunee, if I said that right, Confederacy. It's the original Mooks, M-O-O-C-S, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. That's how I remember it. Just remember Mooks. For those of you in higher education, so that's right, you know what that is. So to them, the white pine is a very key element of their cultural history. And we had a display on this at the Nevin Welcome Center when I first came, and I still don't know if it was just by happenstance that I'm interested in this and happened to be there, or somebody said, let's get this guy done. Anyway, so they have, there's all the symbolism. So they have how many needles in the fascicle, per fascicle of a white pine? 5, okay. So they represent each of those Native American nations that are part of this confederacy. And there's some symbolism. There's an eagle on the top of the tree and all this kind of thing. But if the tree falls over, if it's tipped over in a windstorm or whatever, the root ball comes up, you've got this big depression in the ground, and that's where they would bury their weapons and then cover them up. Then the rainwater, the stream, or whatever would carry away that violence. And that would be the end of war, supposedly. Anyway, so they call it here the tree of the great long leaves, but it's also referred to in their culture as the tree of peace. So if the white pine were to disappear, not that it will, but it has been threatened over centuries by logging, overlogging, and one disease or another. It's possible that something like this could disappear from a culture, and there goes another piece of that culture's integrity. So some other things we're doing in Dunn, Raykau can speak to these much more expertly than can I, but we can also refer to and acknowledge and respect other cultures just through horticulture as well. And so we plan on continuing to promote this East Asian garden that Don was involved in developing as a way to get people more engaged in Asian cultures and how plants have been used in those cultures for ornamental, aesthetic, and other purposes. So there'll be some focus, unless things change dramatically, on some aspects of Korean, Japanese, and Korean culture and how they use plants in various ways. And this is not just if you think about 19% I read of Cornell undergraduates self-identify as Asian, so that's either Asian American or from Asia, coming here from Asia for school. That's a significant population here. And there's very little here that's for them. And we don't have to do something just for them, but it's also an opportunity for us to learn more about them. So it goes both ways. And then the peony and perennial garden, which may be in that Great Lawn area, or a portion of it, depending on how the fundraising goes and all this kind of thing. Things always change and scales change, but peonies are another plant that are very important in some aspects of Asian horticulture and gardens. So there are ways in which we can draw different cultures in here, and then from there we can explore out in any number of different avenues. So if you're wondering what the hell was that all about, here's the summary slide. We're a living museum, so we have to maintain our horticulture and educational excellence. That goes without saying. So some people say, well, you're not going to be a botanic garden anymore. Yes, we are. We're going to be a better one and a more impactful one. And we have to remain indispensable to Cornell, to the faculty, the students, and to the community, and forge relationships and partnerships with people in other disciplines, in the humanities in particular, and social sciences, and do more in terms of informing people about this intimate link, this sort of co-evolutionary link between nature and cultures. And I usually like to close things by this phrase from Shakespeare that he put in the words of Ulysses, and I think otherwise I just can't get through Troilus and Cressida. But anyway, he said, "One touch of nature makes the whole world kin." And I think if we use this as our mantra moving forward and think about this nature and culture thing, we'll have left the world a better place. So thank you very much for your attention. Well, how many of you are graduate students or undergraduate students? Oh my God. How can you support these people? So do you take courses in some of these other areas? I have graduate students come to me from time to time and say, "So give me your best career advice." And I said, "Don't focus." You get so deeply embedded in that statistics course or that biochem course and this kind of thing, things that relate to getting together in that particular field that is really useful. They don't make course catalogs anymore that are hard copy, I don't think. Back in the day, you could just go like this, and then stick your finger somewhere, okay, I'm going to take that course. And musicology of whatever the case may be. So I think it may be a better, whatever you want to be when you grow up, person, to expand, take courses in anthropology, go and dig somewhere, or whatever the case may be. Likewise. Ben, yes?
You alluded to, Plantations moving having a more active role in the humanities and social sciences. Are there particular departments within Cornell that you're kind of seeking to build those?
Well, we're doing some of that through the lecture series that I have in the fall, and with Sonia, we have a pretty good relationship now with the English department, but I want to expand on that in theater, filmmaking. There's a fellow, Toby McLeod, just really goes by Toby McLeod, has got a nonprofit called Sacred Lands Project, and he's been going around the world videotaping these different cultures, mainly disappearing cultures, and talking to them, interviewing them about their relationship to the landscape around them. So I'm interested in working with people like that as well. We can't work with them directly here. We can bring some of these people in too. So Sonia doesn't know this, but thinking about ways in which we can get some of this information out through these lecture series. And so what if we had this woman who's Indian, who did this, I don't know what you call it, multimedia kind of thing called Himalayan snow, where she's looking at climate change in the Himalayas, the snow melting, the glaciers melting, and the impact that's having on those cultures that live in and around the mountains there, and then what impact that cultural loss is having on her mother in New York, because now her culture there is disappearing, so she's feeling this loss herself. So you can connect those dots generationally, you can connect them geographically, spatially, and temporally. And so what she does is she has this video thing that's playing while she's talking over it, and there's this music and this playing music along with it as well, and it's extremely powerful. So I don't want it to be pedantic necessarily or lecturing as we get more into these things. At least we need to not only approach the humanities, but to some extent we also need to take that humanities approach in some ways to what we're doing and how we're engaging. There's a question in the back. Yes?
Yeah.
Hi, Jane.
I was really pleased to see when you were talking about biocultural diversity that then you brought the issue back to, kind of where we are today with the Haudenosaunee and Iroquois. I think one of the issues that, it sounds easy to talk about preserving plants, and everybody wants to protect the white pine or the black ash or those types of things, and thinking about forming partnerships with native peoples in the region. But the place where it gets hard is in terms of political sovereignty. And this last year, 2014, was the 400th year of the Two-Row Wampum, which represents the political agreement between Iroquois Haudenosaunee peoples and non-native peoples. It started with the Dutch, but then it also kind of frames the relationship between the Haudenosaunee and U.S. people today. And where that comes, the kind of rubber meets the road in difficulty is that much of New York State is under land claim conflict, meaning that these people, for whom we would like to save the white pine, have serious and legitimate claims to property in New York State based on political sovereignty. And so to not recognize that is to kind of frame the question in not a trivial way, but in a way that doesn't really recognize that native indigenous peoples in New York State, in northern North America, are indigenous political entities with the desires to have their own land, their own government, and all the rest. And so biocultural conservation, when we form partnerships like that, to be effective, the very first thing has to recognize the political sovereignty of those groups. So I salute you for bringing up the biocultural diversity and say, let's not forget that there is political and all sorts of issues that go along with this right here in our own backyard. And talk to people in Cayuga County about how friendly they are with the Cayuga Nation, and you'll probably get slapped in the face, right? Because they don't like the Cayugas, and they could care less about the white pine.
Well, okay, that's true. When I was setting up this, I agree with all of that. When I was setting this thing up in Hawaii, we did get because there were Native Americans involved, and a lot of Native Hawaiians on the faculty there who are all engaged in this, in the Native Hawaiian Studies program as well as in the law school and others. So yes, we did bring in all that whole political thing. And it's a pretty dynamic system there too in Hawaii and in Aotearoa in New Zealand with the Maori. But through these different partnerships, you develop respect, and from there you can work together and try to resolve some of these things. So it's working out quite well in Hawaii right now, and Aotearoa is working out fairly well, and I have no doubt that the situation here will be resolved in some way that not everybody's unhappy.
Good. Christopher, it seems that in considering this rapid loss of indigenous languages, that it's either being caused by geographic changes, such as these people living on the atolls no longer being able to live there because of rising ocean levels, or because members of the groups that speak those languages are migrating to cities and no longer identifying with their culture, or the people are just dying out. So, yes, given those factors, what realistically, practically can be done to preserve these dying languages?
Well, that's where we work with anthropologists and linguistics, linguists more than anybody else. They're the ones who can help us with that. And generally what happens is that you go to these places where this is occurring and you interview the people. And some of them say, we don't want your help. If we die out. Or we'd be better off if we did assimilate into a large different culture, this kind of thing. So you can't impose anything on anybody. So some of these languages and cultures are going to die out because that's what they want, for one reason or another. There are many in which they do want their culture to be archived, and they're bemoaning the fact that it's disappearing. And the least we can do is archive it for posterity and understand it and have it interpreted so we know what all these words and language and stories and songs and dances mean, and gain the information from that. Beyond that, what is happening in some places is instituting language training programs. Many of the older people don't know really how to teach a language to somebody who doesn't speak it. So we can bring in people who can help with that, developing lexicons for languages. We also developed, the group that I was working with, medicinals for some of these cultures. So they have the plants, they have it written out in their language what these plants are, what they're used for, whatever. So they can use those as teaching tools for the next generation. So I'm not an expert in that, but there are any number of different ways in which some of that can be reversed. But the big thing, in order for a language to remain viable, is that it has, number one, it has to be passed down from one generation to the next. And so when you're looking to see if a language is in danger, that's the first thing you look at. Is the language being transmitted? If it isn't being transmitted, then you have to look at why, and what can we do to reverse that? Yes.
Eloy Rodriguez in Plymouth. I teach a course called Medical Ethnobotany of American Indians. And what I've noticed from the students and the public is an incredible interest in plants and medicine and health. And it's rare that you go to gardens anywhere where they're really very conscious of this. I mean, the public is constantly consuming all kinds of botanical stuff. I wish they're clueless what they're taking. They are. I mean, it's a multi-billion industry. So I guess my question is, how can gardens get into a topic which deals with medicine, deals with health, which everybody's interested in, and you can touch, especially in the ancient medicine of the American Indians from North America, South America. I mean, this is an incredible wealth. And I'm just,
you know, answer that question. She's our herb gardener. Answer that question.
Well, in the herb garden at the Plantations, we have 17 theme beds. We have 2 beds that are devoted to medicinal plants, many of which originate in Western and European culture, and a few from China and a few from India. And we also have, one of the theme beds is herbs of the Native of American Indians. It's very small, and they are located all around us in the trees. The trees are medicine, the shrubs are medicine. They have medicinal properties. So they're featured all around us, not just within this confines of this very small bed. And the wildflower garden at the Plantations has the woodland native plants, some of which are medicinal and some are edible. So it's through interpretive programs, I think, that we can learn a lot more, because we can only feature a very small percentage within the context of the herb garden. So then bring in guest speakers, native guest speakers, have Jane give us some programs and maybe help us network with the indigenous population. There's a state historic park called Ganondagon, which is in Victor, New York, outside of Victor, New York, about an hour and a half north of here. And they are state park on the site of an old Seneca historic village where they had 150 longhouses. And it's a magnificent site, a great resource for us.
We can also make the collections that in the gardens available to those on campus. We were saying that researchers and students and such, so that they can use the plant materials, they can extract the chemicals, they can test them to see if they do have activity.
That's what we do.
That kind of thing, yes. So we can be a resource for that. So that's part of our mission, is to be a resource for you, to be able to do that work, and your students to be able to do that work for the betterment of humankind. So whatever we can do to assist in that, that's what we're there for.
I have 20 undergraduates doing that.
That's too many.
Working with oh no, that's never enough.
Actually, we need to cut things off. I want to again thank Dr. Dunn for that fascinating lecture.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.